for bringing some common sense to the principles of checks and balances of government. In this particular case, it's not checks and balances between the legislative branch and the executive branch so much as it is injecting another level of checks on abuse of authority within the executive branch. So I strongly support this act and the bipartisan work of you two senators to bring greater accountability to the attorneys at the Department of Justice. Congress created inspector generals to be independent. They don't just investigate whatever their agency or Congress might want them to do. The law says that inspectors general shine a light on waste, fraud, and abuse in federal agencies. Sometimes transparency is very uncomfortable, but it's extremely necessary. You're not going to get real accountability if you have an agency's employees policing themselves. Right now, the only folks who can investigate the Justice Department attorneys are other Justice Department attorneys. This system erodes public trust and creates clear conflict of interest. For example, the Justice Department attorneys reviewed the plea agreement given to serial child sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. I note that many of my colleagues here found that internal review substantively inadequate. Those are words from my colleagues. Had the Inspector General conducted the review, he might have gotten somewheres with it, just like he did with the behavior of FBI agents in the Larry Nassar case. What if we had left the investigation to the FBI to police itself? This is why the Justice Department Inspector General has identified as the agency's #1 top management challenge, quote, strengthening public trust in the Justice Department. One way to fix that is to make sure the independent Inspector General has the same authority over all department employees. Why do FBI analysts and DA agents require more independent scrutiny than department's attorneys? This is so simple that even a lawyer could get this. I heard rumors that my friend Senator Cotton may be objecting to this. A person I agree with 90% of the time. It seems to be very uncharacteristic. He and I believe alike that there's two ways of doing business in the United States: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or let the bureaucrats run everything. And I know Senator Cotton is a person that doesn't think bureaucrats should run everything. And in this case, nothing's reviewable by people that make a decision not to produce this. That's the height of irresponsibility. I yield.
President,
Illinois.
I thank the senator from Iowa for his spirited support of this effort. I'm glad he used that classic example of all the hearings, and we've had many good ones and many important ones in the Senate Judiciary Committee this week, or this year. The one we all remember is when the gymnasts came. The Olympic gymnasts came. These wonderful young women came before us and summoned the courage to tell us about the abuse that took place by a man who purported to be a doctor, Larry Nassar. And then sitting next to them during the entire presentation was the head of the FBI, taking the medicine he should have taken, because the Inspector General gave us a graphic report of how the agents at the Federal Bureau of Investigations let those young women down. When they summoned the courage to come forward and to tell the world what had happened to them, it was virtually ignored by the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Thank goodness the Inspector General was there to be critical, to produce the evidence, and to make it clear to the American people that this conduct was disgusting and deplorable and unacceptable. The Inspector General was critical for the administration of justice. Why is it any different if instead of an attorney who works for the Federal Bureau of Investigations, we're talking about an attorney who works in a U.S. Attorney's office somewhere in the United States or in the Department of Justice itself? It shouldn't make a difference. And as Senator Grassley and Senator Lee have made clear, All we are asking for is the same level of accountability for attorneys in the Department of Justice that applies to every other federal agency. Why are we treating these attorneys any differently? Senator Grassley makes the point. We are succumbing to bureaucratic deference at a time when we ought to have our eyes wide open. And wide open, we would see that this bill, which was extensively debated and discussed last year and reported out of the Senate Judiciary Committee under the chairmanship of Senator Graham by a vote of 21-1, wasn't called on the calendar. We're bringing it back this year in the same manner, and we've had extensive discussions last year. The bill has not changed. We're bringing it back this year, and I believe now is the time for us to do what is right for the cause of justice. And so I ask unanimous consent the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-426 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time, passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Arkansas is recognized.
Mr. President, I oppose passage of the Inspector General Access Act. This bill or similar versions of it have been around for at least a decade now. To my knowledge, the Judiciary Committee hasn't had a hearing on this specific issue. Certainly haven't had one this year. As my colleagues have said, this bill has bipartisan support, and they have a principled position on the bill. I think the senator from Illinois pointed out that he supports the bill now that Merrick Garland is the Attorney General, just like the senator from Utah supported it when Bill Barr was the Attorney General, just like the senator from Iowa supported it when Bill Barr was the Attorney General. So it is true it has bipartisan support, but bipartisanship can cut another way as well. To my knowledge, every Attorney General, both Democrat and Republican, has opposed this bill since the very beginning of the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. Both the senator from Illinois and the senator from Utah used the word loophole, a loophole that the Inspector General can't investigate attorneys in the Department of Justice. That implies it was an unintended consequence. That's simply not the case. In 1988, when Congress created the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, Congress had detailed negotiations with the Department of Justice under the leadership of Attorney General Thornburgh, and they reached a compromise to keep investigations of allegations of attorney professional misconduct within the responsibility of the Office of Professional Responsibility. In 2007, Eric Holder, not someone whom I usually cite as an authority, after he had been the Deputy Attorney General, called an earlier version of this bill deleterious and unnecessary. And he said he believed strongly that it would create additional opportunities for improper political concerns to influence law enforcement decisions. In other words, Eric Holder thought that the bill would compound the problem it purported to address. In 2017, the Department of Justice once again articulated similar concerns with the bill, and just yesterday I can relay that the esteemed Judge Michael Mukasey, also a former Attorney General, said that he opposed the expansion of Inspector General authority into allegations of attorney professional misconduct, which has always been handled competently by the Office of Professional Responsibility. Judge Mukasey also relayed that he'd be happy to testify at a hearing at a later date on such legislation. I share some of those same concerns raised about this bill, and I think at the very least that we should have a hearing into what would be a significant change in the way the department polices allegations of attorney misconduct to study its relevance and its impact. I want to note that the Office of Professional Responsibility historically has conducted its investigations with integrity and competence. I did not hear any allegations to the contrary today either. That's in part because it's composed of attorneys, both former prosecutors and former defense attorneys, who have decades of experience and special expertise in legal ethics rules and the many complicated decisions any department attorney makes in the process of charging grand jury proceedings or jury trials. The Inspector General and his investigators simply do not have that expertise. The Inspector General is charged with investigating waste, fraud, and abuse. We also heard some today about independence and alleged conflicts of interest. I have to say I'm also concerned that this bill would create a serious conflict of interest itself if the Inspector General is given broad authority to investigate allegations of attorney professional misconduct. The Inspector General can and does refer criminal matters to department prosecutors. Well, let's say a prosecutor declines to prosecute one of these referrals, and an inspector general could then come up with any reason to investigate that prosecutor. I think we all agree that the determination of who will be prosecuted or not be prosecuted lies with, indeed must constitutionally lie with, the Attorney General, and that the Inspector General should not be able to influence who is prosecuted or not prosecuted with the looming threat of potential investigation. I, of course, as the senator from Iowa said, do not want to see government of the bureaucrats, but I would point out that the Inspector General is a bureaucrat. The Attorney General is a politically accountable officer of the United States. I also have concerns that this bill could empower criminals. Criminals could additionally use the Inspector General to try to harass federal prosecutors by making them targets of unfounded investigations. With the wrong Inspector General, with the wrong political climate, a career prosecutor could be pressured by left-wing jailbreak advocates into dropping cases against violent criminals, pursuing cases against police officers who broke no laws. It's not surprising that this bill is supported by left-wing groups such as the ACLU, Demand Progress, and the Brennan Center. The Inspector General could easily weaponize professional misconduct investigations also to defeat anti-crime policies that an executive branch chooses to pursue. Imagine, for instance, an Inspector General who refused to dismiss allegations of racism when a U.S. Attorney's Office simply chooses to prioritize gun prosecutions in high-crime areas. Such investigations would have a chilling effect, of course, on other offices prioritizing similar prosecutions. We also heard some about transparency, but I would note that this bill does not necessarily provide more transparency because, just like the Office of Professional Responsibility, the Inspector General is governed by the Privacy Act, rules pertaining to grand jury materials, and court orders sealing documents. This bill would not change that. If it's punishments and sanctions that the bill is concerned about, I would also note that the Office of Professional Responsibility is not responsible for the level of discipline imposed. That falls instead to the Professional Misconduct Review Unit, a unit created by then Attorney General Eric Holder in 2014. Expansion of Inspector General jurisdiction would not change where that responsibility falls. I, of course, share concerns of my colleagues about politically motivated prosecutions or prosecutions pursued by so-called glory seekers, but I do not want to proceed down a path where we unintentionally exacerbate the very problem we're trying to solve. Therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The senator from Illinois is recognized.
disappointed by the objection by the senator from Arkansas. This has overwhelmingly has bipartisan support in the House and in the Senate. And we had an opportunity to make history today, and we've missed that opportunity for the moment. The suggestion that inspector generals are not up to the job of inspecting attorneys, I'm afraid if you look at the fact that every other federal agency's lawyers are subject to review and scrutiny by the inspectors general and their departments, it certainly says that that particular observation is not accurate. The argument that the Attorney General, because he is approved by the President directly and by Congress, should be the person to make this decision, overlooks the obvious. Each Inspector General goes through the approval process and nomination process and advise and consent of the Senate. So they are subject to the same level of scrutiny. And I might also add, what we are suggesting has been an evolution that I think really calls for this change that we've asked for in this measure. But in the course of that evolution, in the year 2002, the Inspector General's responsibilities were extended within the Department of Justice to apply to both the FBI and DEA agents who are involved, obviously, in significant law enforcement operations within the department. The Inspector General has handled that responsibility without jeopardizing any prosecutions. So I think that argument is certainly a weak argument when you look at the facts since 2002. We'll return with this. I'm glad to have bipartisan support of Senators Lee and Grassley. There is more to be said on this subject. And I believe that if we are going to apply the standard of IG's responsibility for lawyers' activity across federal government, there is no reason to make an exception for the Department of Justice. I yield the floor.
The senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, I agree with and echo the observations made by my friend and distinguished colleague, the senator from Illinois. I'd like to add a couple of things in response to the observations and the remarks presented by the senator from Arkansas. One of the points that he made that I feel compelled to respond to is he expressed concern about what he describes as the potential weaponization of respond in particular to his argument that the Inspector General Access Act could result in the weaponization of allegations of attorney misconduct within the Department of Justice, and that this could be used in circumstances to intimidate, threaten, and harass Department of Justice attorneys, including prosecutors, from either taking or not taking actions or in retaliation to the same. This is always a concern. It's a concern that follows government generally. It's in particular a concern that follows federal prosecutors. It's also not a concern that is unique to the Inspector General's Access Act. With or without passage of this, there is always a risk of that happening. Nothing about that risk that we immunize ourselves from by leaving intact the loophole, and it is a loophole. It is a deliberate carve-out in Section 8E of the Inspector General Act. It is a loophole, and my friend from Arkansas is right. It's not unintended. It is intentionally created. It was there for a reason. I don't mean to suggest any nefarious motive on the part of those who created it, but I think it might have been a short-sighted move at the time. It's a move that, at least in time, has exposed a certain vulnerability in Democratic and Republican administrations alike. So if the risk is weaponizing allegations of professional misconduct against Department of Justice lawyers, that is not something that we're immune from today. It's something that I'm certain the Office of Professional Responsibility deals with all the time. It doesn't mean we'd make ourselves more vulnerable to it simply by allowing the Inspector General of the Department of Justice to do his or her job without regard to who's a lawyer and who's not, and without regard to this special carve-out for this one federal agency that makes it different from every other federal agency, including that makes Department of Justice lawyers different from attorneys in every federal agency. So if the risk is that you might have people who, for bad reasons, might make up allegations of misconduct, there is no more risk of that with an Inspector General than there is with the Office of Professional Responsibility. But here again, they perform different functions. One of them is there specifically to deal with the rules of professional responsibility within the practice of law by Department of Justice lawyers. That is their focus. Their focus is not a broad one. Their focus does not include or extend to issuing a public report to inform the public about abuses of power. And my friend from Arkansas is right. They can go in if there are allegations of criminal misconduct, and if they've got evidence of the same that they've got to pursue. Yeah, they can do that. That doesn't mean we don't need an Inspector General capable of doing the job of the Inspector General. He also made the argument that there is no expertise among and between inspectors general with regard to handling allegations of attorney misconduct. Well, if that's true, the same can be said of all other attorneys in all other departments. My friend from Arkansas does correctly point out that attorneys within the Department of Justice, at least some of them, do perform different functions than what we see from attorneys in other federal agencies. That part is true. But that doesn't mean inspectors general assigned to the Department of Justice don't have the expertise necessary to investigate the types of allegations that they typically investigate. My friend from Arkansas also points out that inspectors general tend to focus on allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse. Yes, this is absolutely true. And this is absolutely why we should not limit the access that inspectors general in the Department of Justice have to attorneys. Remember, this is a department that's all about law. It's focused on law. It's therefore not surprising that they've got an unusual abundance of lawyers. And you know what the Office of Professional Responsibility is not focused on, is not really their role? They're not involved in, they're not trained in, their focus is not on issuing public reports informing the American people of allegations of things like waste, fraud, and abuse generally. They have a much narrower function. They perform that function especially well. They perform it laudably, and they do a great job of doing it. It's not the same thing as an IG. We need IGs with access to, visibility into the Department of Justice. We don't have it now. We haven't since 1988. 33 years is long enough. Let's close the 8E loophole. Give the Department of Justice Inspector General the access needed. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from Iowa.